Today we will be examining the story of Balaam and Balak, which is found in Numbers 22 through 24. The most popular part of this story is that of the donkey and the angel. However, upon revisiting these chapters, I was struck more this time by the last half of the story, wherein Balaam consents to go to Balak, and there is asked to pronounce a cursing upon the children of Jacob. Though I don't care to relate the story in detail, the gist of it is that Balak, the king of Moab, is scared of Israel. He hires Balaam to curse Israel, but Balaam does just the opposite. 3 times, in fact, he blesses the children of Jacob. To Balaam's credit, he warned Balak multiple times that he would only speak those words which Yahovah placed into his mouth. But Balak insisted, saying that he would make Balaam popular and give him money and cattle and great honors. All the same, Balaam was not swayed and was faithful to the words given to him by God. It's a good story. At first glance, we have a faithful prophet, a man who cannot be swayed to deceit and treachery by the cares of the world. And upon further examination, there appears several other implications which I find fascinating as it regards our own stance toward the truth. It is these that I will examine today. 1. Strategy. Balak devised a strategy to do Israel in. However, the strategy required the buy-in of another individual, namely Balaam. And this is a fatal flaw in any strategy. When we examine Christ and his mission in terms of strategy, we see the absence of this need for buy-in or external supports. This is not to say that Christ did not desire buy-in, for he repeatedly opened his mouth in opposition to the pervading culture, and that with the intent that he might be heard, and that the hearer might believe, and do something similar to that which Christ himself would do. But he did not require any other person to do anything in order to accomplish his task. And ultimately, his task was to suffer well. Suffering well is a powerful strategy. Painful, long, but powerful. And it requires no action or support from any other being in the universe. And here we see Balak's weakness, for he was not prepared to suffer. And in that he had lost before he began, for he was not even able to endure bad news, much less ultimate loss. 2. Profit for profit. In other words, Prophet for Profit, or the God-Mammon dilemma. So Balak appealed to the God of the unseen world. I find this interesting. He could have conjured up some enchantment to another god, but seemed to recognize the fact that this was a job for Yahovah, or the God of the unseen world. And that makes sense in light of his predicament. Other gods might be invoked wherein you feel that you have some inkling of what you are up against. But at the time when Balak saw that he was up against a power that lurked in the great unknown, he decided to invoke the God who was most foreign to him. Fascinating. But he discovers quickly that this God and his servants are unlike any god with whom he is familiar, for they cannot be bought by money, power, or influence, nor can they be reasoned with by any means whatever, and thus they lie outside the influence of Mammon. 3. Balak values his life very highly, too highly. In the story of Balak and Balaam, we find an archetypal contrast. so that those traits which we most admire in Balaam, we find blatantly missing in Balak. Balaam is faithful to the truth, valuing it above wealth and property and power, and even above his own life. For Balak could have easily decided to kill Balaam for his impudence. And it is this particular trait of truth and faithfulness in Balaam, even in the face of death, that Yahovah prizes most highly. It is the distinguishing feature of the followers of God. On the other hand, Balak lacks this important quality. He and his people are terribly concerned for their lands and their property, and ultimately their heads. Contrast this with John the Baptist, who, when one greater than he came, said, "He must increase, but I decrease." And when God had made good use of him, John the Baptist, he gladly gave his head as a testimony of the truth for which he stood. No less is required of us. It is not a platitude, but a principle. You cannot have a portion with those who have given the ultimate price, unless your ultimate price is held always in the hand of the Master, as a sort of earnest money, so to speak, of that inheritance which is not of this world. 4. Good and bad. Balaam at one point tells Balak that he cannot go beyond the word of the Lord to speak good or bad. Good or bad? What does that mean? Good or bad? I am struck by the fact that good or bad is for the most part completely subjective adjectives, are subjective adjectives. In general, good is what is good for the particular self who desires things to go their way, and bad is that thing which appears harmful to oneself. But history proves that people often don't know what is good for them, and do not act in their best interest, nor in the interest of that truth whose interest it is to bless mankind. That which they believe to be good, quote unquote, in the end is bad. And that which they hope to avoid as being bad is the one thing that could bring a little good into their lives. The modernists insist that we are living in a good time. There is less poverty than ever. The standard of living is climbing, and man's life expectancy has been lengthened. And yet, just on the outskirts of our sheltered good life, quote unquote, looms the threat of consequence, so that we've exchanged our disease for the threat of superbugs. We have exchanged our poverty with the threats of unsustainable agriculture and economic fragility. And we have lengthened our lives in exchange for the threat of complete annihilation and extinction as a species. Truly, we live in a time when bad is called good and good is called bad. It appears that Balak takes the same view of good and bad. Good is what Balak believes is good for Balak, and bad is what Balak believes is bad for Balak. 5. Balak's deepening demise. I cannot help but be surprised at Balak's persistence. You would think that he would have been leery of hiring Balaam, for the prophet had expressed his unwillingness to commit to an allegiance to Balak's vision. And you would think he would have given up after the prophet's first prediction in favor of the children of Jacob, or if not, after the second. But instead, he held out to the end. Here I guess I cannot blame him. After all, he had no other out. He had turned to the great God of the unseen world, we assume out of desperation. And have we not done the same thing? After resolving that we and our imagined hero selves are no match for a particular predicament, and especially when some unforeseen power looms ominous before us, we turn to the God of last resort, the God whom we have done our best not to bother, in a final, desperate, and often futile plea for help. But so often our end is much like that of Balak, for we discover that the God whom we have so carefully avoided will not be bought. He is not interested in our short-sighted views of good and bad, but in the good itself with a capital G, and that for its own sake, and at any cost whatever, even the cost of our own heads. No wonder mankind has done all they can to avoid such a God, for he is truly great and terrible. But if so, and if we can see him from afar, and if we have not yet reached our greatest extremity, would it not be better to reconcile with him before he is upon us? Truly. Perhaps if we will seek him earnestly, we will find him, and thus align ourselves with that truth which will prepare us for the day when unseen chaos lurks without the camp. That is a hopeful thought, and it transcends any number of terrible ends. To that thought we may lay ourselves down at night, with peace that surpasses understanding, and rise to meet our fate whatever it be. We will not need the buy-in of any fickle prophet or priest, but will rest in the knowledge that whatever our end, we are one with that best interest which decides the fate of us all.